Hello and welcome to Data Conversations Over Coffee with myself, Craig Stewart. Today, or this evening actually, it's not exactly Data Conversations Over Coffee. It's just gone 5 o'clock in the evening here in South Africa. So I've got a Data Conversations over Cab Sav. And the reason being is my guest today is based on the West Coast of the US. So it's his early morning, my evening. Mark Caine, welcome to the show.
Hi there, it's great to be here, Craig. I do in fact have my cup of coffee because I'm just starting my day here in California.
That's good. You're winding up, I'm winding down. But amazing that we can sort of cross this massive geographical divide and have this conversation. So before we kick off and before I sort of get you to introduce yourself, Mark is the lead for AI and ML at the World Economic Forum. I think a lot of people wouldn't really associate AI, ML, ethics and AI with the World Economic Forum, but Mark's going to take us through some really interesting work that they're doing. But before we get into that and get Mark to introduce himself, we spoke yesterday, and Mark, you said that there were some wildfires happening in and around your area. How's that panning out? Under control or not looking too good?
I think the word that is used, unfortunately, is uncontained, which basically means that they're still spreading. It's been very hot. We've had, I think, a record amount of lightning strikes in the last 4 or 5 days, and they are being valiantly fought by a lot of firefighters across the state. But I think progress is halting. The conditions are very tough, so we're keeping our fingers crossed and hoping for the best.
Yeah, likewise. Well, I watched that closely. Hopefully it all turns out okay. So I've given you a brief introduction. Maybe you can just share with the people listening a little bit more insight into your role and what you're doing through the World Economic Forum with regards to AI and specific, I guess, the ethics around this fast advancing technology.
Sure. So the World Economic Forum is the international organization for public-private partnerships. It's been working for about 50 years to bring together all of the kind of key global stakeholders, whether from government, from industry, from nonprofits, from academia, to try to address and solve some of the world's most pressing challenges, particularly the ones where a single sector alone is unlikely to be able to solve it. These are some of the wicked problems that we see around the world, like climate change, sort of structural economic problems in the global economy, things like inequality, and increasingly technology governance, which is an area which we'll talk about a lot on this call, but which we see as being not something that can really be done alone by a single stakeholder group, whether that's government or industry, but really something that requires a very rich set of interactions and partnerships across all of the key stakeholders to be able to keep pace with the very rapid acceleration and change in those technologies that we're working on. So AI and machine learning is one of the focus areas that we have here at our center in San Francisco. We also work on data policy issues, which I know are near and dear to your heart. We work as well on connected devices, Internet of Things, precision medicine, drones, autonomous vehicles, other areas where basically the technological dimension, the technologies themselves have moved more quickly than the policy and the regulatory constructs that ostensibly are supposed to govern them. And so we see our role really as to convene stakeholders into a kind of agile, iterative policymaking dialogue and process to be able to accelerate the policy to keep pace with the technology.
Yeah, and interestingly, in the first episode of the series, I spoke with Nanda Padiachi from a bank here in South Africa, Standard Bank, and one of his sort of key points in the conversation was around the fact that this technology is advancing way quicker than the regulations and the policies and the protection measures around them. And that's something that, as you say, really needs to keep pace because it can get out of control pretty quickly how people, organizations, etc., are actually using AI, for the purposes of this conversation. But if you look at drones, I mean, that's only sort of really now starting to be regulated. But looking, sort of 10 years ago, it was generally spy activity through drones, and it wasn't always done with the right purposes. But now you can sort of measure crops and various other things and deliver medicine, and it's kind of come to an ethical point. So maybe you can talk a little bit around how you work with governments and major organizations to make sure that AI is ethical. And not only that the AI is ethical, but they're using it ethically. And I think that's quite an important distinction, is that, okay, well, yes, we've built in a very ethical sort of AI model here, but how we're using it is maybe not that ethical. So, and that's a big thing to kind of tackle. So maybe you can just let us know how you're going about that.
Yeah, no, it's a huge challenge and opportunity. It's the work of many people in many organizations over many years, and fortunately, we're not the only ones working on it. We're part of I think a really exciting and much needed kind of trend over the last couple of years for ethics to really come to the forefront of the conversation about AI. And I think that we've seen in the last couple of years a real profusion of principles, or ethical principles for how to develop and or use AI, which we see as being a really positive development. Different companies are setting out their stalls saying, look, here's our guardrails, here are the parameters we're putting in place. We work a lot with industry, but since your question's about government, I'll focus mostly on that. We see government as having a really key role to play in the AI ecosystem from a number of different dimensions. I mentioned before the kind of policy and regulatory dimension, and of course that is very important. But of course the government is also a massive purchaser of technology. And so we are working with governments kind of across the full spectrum of these different activities. In New Zealand, for example, we're working with the government there to on a project called Regulator of the Future, where they are firstly creating their own kind of national strategy and regulations for artificial intelligence, but they're also pioneering some new ways of going about that process to make sure that it's done inclusively and with very broad input and engagement from a diverse swath of their society. And I think this is part of the kind of ethics conversation, is making sure that AI is developed and governed in an inclusive way. So they've kicked off a number of national conversations around AI. They've also put together a center of excellence, which will bring together the different stakeholder groups to have an ongoing dialogue and sort of checks and balances around what the government is doing around AI. And so this is one of the ways that we work with governments, is kind of through that regulatory element, and really looking at kind of their strategy with respect to the AI sector in their country. Another example, which is a little bit different, is the work that we've done with the UK government. We worked with the Office of AI, which is joint between their business ministry and their digital ministry, to basically produce what we understand to be the world's first procurement guidelines for a government around how they will buy AI. So what sort of product requirements will an AI have to meet? What kinds of checks and balances and sort of ethical review will have to be in place during that procurement process? And we are, through that work, really excited because it has, I think, helped us understand, number one, kind of how can government shape the market in ways other than regulation? And we're not averse to regulation, of course, but the government has more ways that it can help sort of orient the AI product marketplace through even just its own purchasing power. In the UK, for example, the NHS, the National Health Service, is an absolutely enormous purchaser of technology. And so the decisions they make about what they will or will not buy actually, to a significant degree, help signal to participants in that market, look, here's what you ought to or ought not to produce. And so we're looking at a really wide spectrum with governments, from both the kind of hard side of governance, regulation, policy, law, to the softer side of governance around procurement, around sort of putting together voluntary information sharing, and we're talking about a whole lot of other types of ways of approaching this issue from the governmental perspective, all the while making sure that those governments that we're working with, and this is a big part of our role, are making the decisions that they're making about AI with the best input and information that they can get from both large companies who are either developing or using AI, small companies who are involved in the space in some way, nonprofits, civil society organizations who are representing the citizen interest in all of this, citizens themselves, to the greatest degree possible, and other stakeholder groups, academics who are experts on these topics, etc. And so this is really the role that we play with respect to governments, and watch this space. We have a lot going on. Our goal, last thing I'll say on this is, we really want, this is in a sense, it's a very kind of open space. It's an emerging space, this AI governance conversation. 2-3 years ago, no country had a national AI strategy. Now there are several dozen. In a couple of years, there will probably be several dozen more. And what we are trying to do, along with our partners, is to make sure that all of those governments who are thinking about this problem, they know that they don't have to do it in a silo, that they don't have to sort of do this alone. There are a lot of differences between different countries. The same thing that works in the UK isn't going to work in France, isn't going to work in Colombia, isn't going to work in South Africa. But governments will have to answer many of the same questions in determining what their approach should be. And so we are trying to create a really active, robust dialogue between different governments so that they can kind of shorten the sort of feedback loop of learning and transferring those best practices based on real world experience.
And I mean, there's a lot of work, and you sort of said in the middle of that, it's around sort of developing it based on the requirements of that government, of that country, of the private organization as well. You can almost sort of lump it all together, that it's, it's contextualized and it's being used for a specific purpose. And when we caught up yesterday, just sort of in prep for this call, one of the key things that you really talked about, which really interested me, was the fact that there are so many frameworks out there. Every next consultant or statutory body is coming out with a set of frameworks and guidelines for how to use AI fairly and ethically. Do you think people are getting sort of caught in the trap of they can't see the wood for the trees? There's just so much going on, they don't really know how to apply that. And then are you helping them sort of break that down and say, okay, well, what works for your organization and your purposes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's sort of the negative side of the positive thing that I mentioned earlier, which is, there's a huge amount of attention and kind of energy going into developing good principles for how to do AI ethically. We did a bit of research where we, with our partner PwC, looked across the ecosystem globally and tried to count them all. I think that we counted over 175 sets of ethical principles for AI that have been put out. Yeah. The challenge that we're seeing is that, as it turns out, and this won't surprise anyone, it's much easier to formulate your set of ethical principles, which is essentially a kind of tabletop exercise, than it is to operationalize those principles at the level of product design and use, at the level of organizational policies and processes. And so what we're seeing is a bit of an implementation gap, where we've kind of gotten halfway there in terms of having a really robust conversation about what ethical principles AI should be governed by, but we still have a long ways to go in terms of making sure that actually happens. And this is, in fact, a big focus of our work, is to try to create, with our partners, very concrete, actionable, clear ways to implement those principles through the product design process. We're working on a project co-led by Salesforce, which is focused on the responsible use of technology in that kind of product design and organizational design lens. So that is going to produce some very concrete guidelines and tools whereby any company that's deploying AI can essentially put in place a process to ensure that it is having the right kind of reviews and checks and balances and consultation along the way. And we have a number of other projects which are really looking to kind of bring those principles sort of down to earth. I think one thing that we talked about yesterday that I think is really interesting, where we're just starting to kind of really get our heads around it, and I think a lot of folks are thinking about similar things, is you know, for a given company in a given sector or a given geography, you know, what is the relative weighting of different ethical principles? Of those 175 sets of principles, by the way, we found that there were, you know, roughly 10 or so kind of buckets that all of those principles fell into. Things like fairness, things like transparency. Obviously, these are very big terms, and you know, there's a lot that falls within each of those buckets. But of course, it's valid to ask, you know, do principles like fairness apply to the same degree to certain types of industrial applications where all of the data is just machine data from the factory floor, as it does on a, let's say, an algorithm that's designed to forecast people's A-level grades in the UK, which we just saw last week,
Very relevant, yeah.
was massively problematic and in fact had to be reversed. Probably not, right? Fairness, you know, makes a lot of sense to talk about in the context of those A-level exams. Probably makes less sense to talk about in terms of you know, optimizing a production process on a factory floor. And so I think figuring out which of those principles applies in what scenarios and to what degree is really the challenge facing all developers and users of AI. And I think this is something that we're really trying to focus on with our partners, because I think it will be helpful to a lot of users of AI to understand, you know, where they need to focus their efforts and what they need to prioritize. And it's not to say that any of these principles are more or less important than any others, but it is to say that in particular use case areas, you know, with particular types of data, with particular types of issues that you know, are related to it, we ought to have a kind of more nuanced and variegated approach.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I mean, a lot of the conversations that I have around this, and we sort of had a brief chat about it yesterday, it's a very sort of conceptual, subjective, philosophical sort of view to a degree. I mean, there is, you know, who determines what is fair, what is right? You know, transparency, I guess, is a relatively easy one out of those. But we kind of discussed, like, you know, whose ethics is it based on? You know, who determines what is fair, and how does that differ between organization and government? You know, an African country versus a European country, etc. I mean, there's some things that are just not fair. You know, it's kind of like a societal sort of norm or agreement around that. But there's a lot of other areas. If we just think about, you know, how you market to a customer, you know, that's not necessarily a big societal global issue, but it's, you know, it could be quite a microcosm of, you know, what's going on in a country from a demographics point of view, whatever economic, you know, disparity point of view. What are sort of your comments around, you know, who determines what's fair? You know, who's the ultimate power here? Because if it's all being developed internally, and, you know, the company who's developing says this is fair and this is how we'll use it, it's fair for them. Is it fair for everybody else?
No, it's a fantastic question, and I'm afraid my answer is probably going to be unsatisfactory, because I think this is kind of the key question, you know, as concerns ethical AI is, you know, whose ethics and why and how, and I think it's absolutely right that you know, there is a great diversity around the world of kind of norms and values, and you know, how different countries or cultures or even just individuals prioritize these different values. And it is a big challenge for governments and for companies to you know, try to navigate that. And I think, you know, it's on some level a little bit easier for governments, perhaps, just because, you know, they have a very particular sort of mandate, which is, you know, at least in democracies, you know, ostensibly, they are supposed to be representative of the citizens of that country. And so to the extent that they're able to have a kind of robust national dialogue of the kind I mentioned earlier that we're working on in New Zealand with citizens in that country, you know, that's at least one way that they can try to calibrate that question of, kind of, well, what ethics and what values, should these policies and approaches be oriented around. I think with companies, this question, I think, points to the need for the AI sector in general and all of the participants within it to be more inclusive and expansive in their consultation, in their engagement. I think that it has not been a space that has typically been representative of the population that touches or interfaces with the products or the sort of results of AI algorithms, and I think that has been a huge problem. So I think a big part of this is figuring out how the AI sector, the technology space, can be more inclusive of a more diverse range of voices and perspectives, so that to the extent that there are differences in values and kind of ethical approaches within a particular market or a particular geography, they're at least able to be surfaced. The company can at least be aware of those different perspectives. And then after that awareness is in place, I think a lot of it comes down to transparency. And it's not, probably likely that every company is going to be able to, meet everyone's, standards for, what, an ethical product should look like. And that's where I think people need to be able to have information that allows them to make an informed choice about which kinds of companies and which kinds of products they want to engage with. And this is something that we've seen successfully implemented in areas like food, clothing. You see the fair trade label, the organic label, all of these different ways of kind of certifying that particular standards or in this case not ethical standards, but sort of process standards around food production or clothing manufacturing, many of them based on ethical principles. For example, not wanting to have child labor go into clothing, things like that. Having that information be available to would-be customers, would-be partners, etc., at least gets us part of the way there towards addressing this issue of there just it being a big world and a diverse world, and a lot of people having a lot of different places that they're coming from in terms of what they see as being important from an ethical and values perspective.
Yeah, and this is not really a question, it's more of a pondering from myself, and I'll have a look on LinkedIn to see if I can find someone. But I wonder if companies have or are thinking of having someone in the role of AI ethics officer.
They are indeed, yes. It's actually a job title that has really exploded in the last couple of years.
Okay.
I think we've initially seen that some of the tech companies, many of them in the Bay Area, have added either chief ethics officers or AI ethicists to their teams. They've gone about it in different ways. Some of them call it a chief ethics officer, others call it something else. But I think it's been one of the positive trends of the last couple of years that companies have really started to take this very seriously. And I think it reflects a reality that we're seeing, which is that this is not just about doing the right thing, though of course it is about doing the right thing from these companies' perspectives, but it really is also about the bottom line. There is a kind of double bottom line element here, to use the language from the sustainability space, where it's actually become clear that if companies lose trust, if they lose the social license to operate, they will be hit from a business perspective, that it will not be good from a bottom line perspective. And so bringing ethics to the forefront of the way that they're developing and using AI, I think is really a positive development, a great move, because it ensures that they will, be doing the right thing, which is important from a number of perspectives. Obviously it's just the right thing to do, but also we see that employees of companies lose motivation if they perceive their companies as being kind of on the wrong side of history, as it were. This has become a sort of recruiting point for companies in the tech space, is that they are beneficial and responsible in the technologies that they're creating. So, there's this very sort of, practical element to it as well. And I think that has helped accelerate the progress in kind of elevating this conversation to a higher level within the tech space over the last couple of years. So that's really positive. The last thing I'll say on that is that I am very hopeful that we can expand that focus on AI ethics beyond the tech space in the coming years. And this is something that I am personally, very committed to. I think we are seeing that increasingly it is other sectors, not the technology sector as such, that are becoming the biggest adopters of AI and users of AI, mainly because it can bring a lot of business value to them. Insurance, finance, transportation, health and healthcare, retail, consumer goods. All these areas can see huge amounts of value creation and benefit from the use of AI, but they are not as experienced as some of the tech companies in really thinking through these complicated ethical questions. And so one of my priorities for the period ahead is to start to bring more of those companies into the conversation, and to help them sort of keep pace with the ethics dimension of the AI space, as they come up to speed very quickly on the business dimension of it, which is a very kind of compelling value proposition for them.
Yeah, and I know one of the key things that your focus is on, and maybe we'll talk about it later on in a panel discussion, because there's another bigger thing I want to chat to you about, is really companies, being careful with off-the-shelf AI that they kind of plug their customer data into, but don't really understand how it works or what ethics have been baked into that, because there's that sort of whole thing around the explainability of AI, which kind of comes down to the fairness and transparency of it. And that's a big area, and that's kind of what you're talking about.
No, it's very challenging. I think that this is one of the key trends that we're seeing is that in the beginning of this latest wave of AI in the last several years, it was the same companies who were developing the AI as were using the AI. And you have a sort of bit of an end-to-end kind of oversight over the technology, which allows you to sort of spot problems earlier and to kind of have a more robust oversight and review process. What we're seeing now increasingly is that companies are procuring AI technologies on the market, and then plugging their own data into it. And on the one hand, that is, I think, very exciting from a business model perspective. A lot of companies that can benefit from AI probably do not need to build a massive in-house sort of AI development shop. But at the same time, it does create some unique risks, because if those companies don't have the kind of experience and the knowledge and the staff to really understand the technology, both its potential, but also its limitations and its risks, there is a higher risk that the technology will be used in a way that ends up causing harm or being unethical. And so this is something that I'm very interested in seeing more work happening on, whether by us or by others. And this is something that we started working on. The procurement project that I mentioned in the UK is focused principally on government procurement. But what we found is that actually a lot of the questions that government needs to have answered when it makes a buying decision about a technology are similar questions that a company would need to see answered. And so we are working to sort of retool that product to be kind of specifically relevant for companies, while also developing some separate resources. We have put out, in collaboration with the Spanish bank BBVA, a AI board toolkit, which is a very large suite of training and guidance documents for board members who are responsible with making decisions about the procurement or use of AI by the companies over which they have responsibility. And we are also working to create a similar sort of product for C-suite executives who have the executive level responsibility for AI. And I think this is something that we're going to see a lot more of in the coming years. We will probably see some bad news stories about companies that picked up algorithms from third parties and didn't really quite know what was in the black box, and then plugged in all of their data and made a bunch of decisions on the basis of the output. It would surprise me very much if we didn't see those stories. But I think that if we get out ahead of it, as companies, as a sort of sector, as individuals, hopefully we can, not see so many of those, and we can learn a lot from them, and hopefully move past that.
Yeah, but potentially the AI version of the Enron scandal potentially coming up there. So
yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely, and these are very complex technologies, and they are also evolutionary. Obviously, with the learning algorithm, it will change as the data that comes into it gets analyzed and worked through, and so it presents an even more complicated challenge, I think, than a lot of other technologies that companies have had to think about before, because hitherto any technology that you would procure, you'd essentially, you knew what you were buying, and doesn't mean that you're going to use it perfectly well, but in the case of AI, it's a little bit more complicated because it can and it will evolve based on the data that it's being trained and used on.
Okay, I'm going to put us on the clock here for what I think is maybe a potentially controversial and contentious question. Can it get to a point where people are being, or companies are being too ethical? Ethical is it the point where, yes, we're ethical, you can say we're ethical. Does it get to a point where you're trying to be too ethical and it almost sort of totally sanitizes, dilutes, paralyzes the technology itself? So I'll give us, sort of 45 seconds because there's another thing I really want to talk to you about. But thoughts, too ethical?
I think I wouldn't put it exactly as too ethical. I think the question is, how do we have the right ethical principles applied to the right degree to a given application? So, for example, I don't think you can be too ethical in thinking about how we treat the most sensitive health data for individuals. My genetic code, your genetic code. No, I wouldn't, sort of want anyone to be sort of cutting ethical corners in something like that. But going back to the earlier example, if we're talking about data that is concerned purely with the production of a widget on the factory floor, and it's about optimizing different machines' relationships to one another, there I think it's not the same level of kind of ethical import as some of these more sensitive human applications. So no, I don't think we can be too ethical, but we also have to be careful not to lump throw the baby out with the bathwater, lump everything into the same bucket, and apply the same standards that we apply for genetic data to, say, traffic data. That probably wouldn't make sense, and it would retard, I think, the beneficial use of this technology, which itself, could be considered to be an unethical thing to do, to the extent that, increasing efficiency in something like traffic would be very beneficial to a lot of people.
Yeah. All right. Good answer. Very good. I think it was one of those contentious ones, but I think, the AI ethics officer has probably got their work cut out for them to make sure that it kind of meets specific standards. Mark, we're kind of running out of time, but one of the things I wanted to ask you in closing was, we all know about the need for AI. The technology is incredible. It, can help us make decisions in very quick times, far quicker than potentially humans could do it, and it has far-reaching positive impacts in cancer research and potentially COVID vaccine research, traffic management, etc. So we know there's a need. What are some of the opportunities that you see in AI, and what are some of the challenges that are standing in the way of those opportunities actually being achieved or reached?
That's a great question, and I think a good one to close on. So I think that the potential for AI is absolutely massive across the domains that you mentioned and many, many more. And one of the things that I think is often missing in the conversation about ethical AI is that it is focused sort of narrowly on how do we make the AI applications that we're engaged in or that we're doing right now as ethical as possible. And that's very important. I think we ought to keep our focus on that. But I would like to see an expanded conversation about how do we stimulate and catalyze and encourage new applications of AI towards areas that would create a lot of benefit for people, for society, for the environment, and beyond. And I think that this is something that, it's not sort of the traditional way to look at ethical AI, but on some level, I think it's very important to say, as an ecosystem, as a space, are we focusing this incredible technology on the right things? Of course, AI is fundamentally, an optimization tool, and we can optimize just about anything across almost any sector, and this is why we see there's massive industry disruption happening from AI. But I am not seeing as much as I would like of some of these kind of beneficial uses. The ones that I have seen have been absolutely incredible. I think it was Google when they acquired DeepMind. They, just by virtue of unleashing some machine learning on their data centers, was able to reduce the energy consumption of them while maintaining the equivalent output by, I think, over 30%. Don't quote me on that figure, but it's a significant amount. And I would really like to see more of this kind of application. I think that the COVID moment has been really interesting. I think a lot of people in the AI space, myself included, have, I think, the jury is out, but been, I think, a bit disappointed in the, role that AI has been able to play in the COVID response. I think that it probably could be playing a larger role. But unfortunately, a lot of the kind of AI companies out there and the sort of AI ecosystem more broadly hasn't been fully focused on these kinds of use cases. And it's not to say that there aren't amazing companies out there who are doing that. There are, and increasingly so every day. There seems to be a new one. But I would like to see the space continue to focus laser-like on making sure everything that it's doing is ethical, but also to kind of expand the aperture and to sort of take a look in the mirror and say, what are we using this powerful technology for? What could we be using it for? And how do we get from here to there? And it's not, there will be challenges. You asked about challenges. I won't go too into it. Obviously, it's easier to, exploit applications where the ROI is, immediate and, financial and very clear. In some of these other areas, it's perhaps a bit longer term. Some of the ROI is, on other bottom lines, whether it's kind of sustainability improvements or health improvements or others. But I would like to see as part of the kind of broader, I think, transformation that we're going through globally right now in the COVID era towards, I think, rethinking kind of what we value. I would like to see AI play a kind of leading role in starting to help us at the societal level realize some of these other value streams, as it were, whether that's, reducing carbon emissions, improving health, addressing inequality, expanding education access, whatever it may be. So that is my call to action, I suppose, that I end with, Craig, is, anyone out there listening, keep doing what you're doing, but think about, what else could we be doing with this incredible technology that can really, I think, change the world for the better. And the positive note to end on, I guess, is that I think, look, I think this is the opportunity of a generation. I think we to young people who are just entering the space, there are decades ahead where we really have an opportunity to make a significant difference. And so I'm very optimistic, but I'm going to keep pushing because I don't think that it's going to all happen on its own.
Yeah, an impassioned plea there and call to the market, Mark. Thank you so much. And I think my sort of closing sort of thought to put out to everybody listening to sort of think upon as you think about AI and sort of to the singularity point is, will we at some point get to a scenario where there's an AI that is totally unbiased and fair and ethical, that has built in and sort of consumed and learned everything else that is out there, that is there to govern other AI models to make sure that they are ethical? So at what point will AI be making sure that other AI is ethical? And that is probably a conversation for a movie script. But Mark,
my goodness, I think I'm going to need my glass of wine for that one, not this cup of coffee.
Yeah, that's a bit of a sort of a mind blower for late in the afternoon for me. Mark, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much. It's been great to chat to you. I look forward to chatting to you again and continue doing the great work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. It's been a pleasure. And yeah, please do keep in touch.